All right, we're going to take a look at chapter 16, and I'm going to go through some of the reading that I think is really important and try to guide you through some of this chapter. This chapter is a pretty complicated chapter. It begins by taking a look at how the Europeans interacted with Asia, and then it's going to kind of take us into a blow-by-blow account of the way Asia is from 1500 to 1700. So you're going to see what the major empires of Southern Asia or Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, or okay, you're going to talk a little bit about India. You're going to talk a little bit about China and Ming China. You're going to talk a little bit and read a little bit about Korea and Vietnam and some of the smaller areas, Japan included. And you're also going to talk a little bit about some of the Eastern religions as well. But the goal here is you're trying to get a big, clear picture of why the Europeans were out here, what they were doing out here, what were they trying to get to. So the first part of the chapter, after you get through some of the introductory stuff about Matteo Ricci and his travels, you get to one of the early parts of the chapter here, which talks about Portuguese and Dutch, all right, development in Southeast Asia. So, or in Southern Asia. So this first part of the chapter right here, when you get to the maritime trade connections, okay, you're going to basically be reading about Portugal and about the Dutch, okay, about the Netherlands. So the book kind of goes back and takes a look at how the Portuguese managed to make their way into India. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and then later would sail for East India. The when you look at the map here, the Portuguese would eventually make it over here to India, and eventually would set up really an empire based here around Malacca, where they would then try to trade in various parts of Southeast Asia. The Portuguese really remained dominant in this area until about the middle of the 1600s or so. So from Malacca right here, the Portuguese were a pretty dominant power in many of these areas, trading in many of these areas until they get basically booted out of this area by the Dutch. The Dutch were a much more modern group. The Dutch had better ships. They had highly armed ships. They used force when they had to protect their shipping. And so when you get to the introduction about the Dutch, then you will find out that they are some of the first to pool their resources to minimize some of the risk. And so when you get to the Dutch here, one of the first things the book talks about is joint stock companies where investors pooled their money and kind of defrayed the costs of poor returns, but on good trips they were able to make a profit. So the Dutch had a lot of financial backing. They had a lot of really entrepreneurial spirit. Up here you read about the bourgeoisie, which in French, bourg is a walled town. And so bourgeoisie really in French is kind of a word for town dwellers. So when we kind of put that together, the people that live in the towns are often middle class. And so bourgeoisie becomes sort of identified with the concept of being middle class. So they were the investors, okay? And the greatest of the joint stock companies, the Dutch East India Company, which you'll read about here. In 1641, they seized Malacca from the Dutch and began to establish other trading areas throughout this area. So the Europeans would move in here. They would begin to influence not only Asia, but also Africa. We've talked a little bit about the slave trade, and one of the next things that the book does discuss is the development of the slave trade, what was happening in Africa. So when you get to this part, make sure that you are kind of understanding that one of the things that's happening and one of the reasons that it happens is because of contact once the Portuguese made contact with Africa, and they understood that it was a place that they could get gold from, but they also later are going to understand that they can get slaves from there as well. And so you'll get to see some of the development, further development of the slave trade, which is something we've already talked about a little bit. Now, the next part of the chapter is we basically sort of get into what Southern and Eastern Asia looked like between 1500 and almost 1700 or so. So when you get to this part, it's important to kind of take a second and start to sort out who's who. So one of the first things you probably ought to jot down is Mughal India and begin to kind of separate out who's who, okay? Most famous ruler of Mughal India is Akbar, and you'll read about Akbar. The Mughals will come in, they will reorganize India, and under Akbar, one of their most famous rulers, they will begin to dominate India. So you'll read about this. You'll read about some of the major leaders of Mughal India and how India was developing during this period of time. Then you move over and talk about Ming China, and you'll kind of read about the situation in Ming China, the importance of Confucianism, the importance of Confucianism to the civil service exam, which you'll read about there. Okay, how the Ming Dynasty was doing. Okay, and you can see that it's not very good when you get a paragraph like this. It says decline of Ming China is associated with the Wanli Emperor. So what's happening in China? Okay. Then you'll move on, take a little bit of time to talk about Korea, Vietnam, Japan, and Siam, which is Thailand. Okay. And so the book kind of goes through each of these. And so as you go through them, make sure that you sort of jot down what's going on in each of these areas. Okay. It finishes up, the text finishes up taking a look at some of the challenges to Catholicism. Okay. One of the first challenges actually comes from Europe, and you ought to be aware of who Martin Luther is and what the Reformation is. Okay. So who Martin Luther is, and you read about Martin Luther here. Okay, what the Reformation is, which is where groups in Europe began to protest against problems in the Catholic Church. And following Luther's example, they would eventually begin to either demand change and reform, or they began to walk away from the Church of England. So it's important to understand some of these challenges to Catholicism as the dominant Christian faith. Okay, and they'll come from the Reformation. They'll actually come from science, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later on. Okay, and so be aware of that. But it also takes us back out into Southeast Asia and then parts of Asia to talk about religion there. And for example, you need to learn what Sikhism is. Okay, the how influential Islam is in this area, and what Sikhism is once it develops. Okay, Confucianism is another thing that you'll sort of need to be aware of. Okay, especially because it becomes a vital part of the Chinese civil service exam. Okay, and so you'll be reading about that. The text wants to deal with not only challenges to Christianity, but really how some of these religions also began to develop. And like I said, you'll read about Sikhism, for example, and others. When you finish the chapter, make sure that you go back and look over these key terms, that you know all of those, because you'll see them on your quizzes and on your exams in one way or another. Now, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on this, okay? But that's sort of how the chapter develops, and it's important for you as you do your reading, like I asked you in the last video, to learn how to start taking notes for this, okay? As you read, jot down a few notes for each of these major things that you talk about. That you know what each of these terms means, because that's how you're going to be tested on this stuff. You're going to see this stuff. So pay attention as you go through the text and that you understand what each of these terms is. Okay. All right. Keep reading. Good luck.